Nia Williams sat nervously in the crowded courtroom. The walls seemed to close in as she shifted in her seat. Her mind raced as she glanced at the clock on the wall, ticking away each second in a rhythm that only deepened the pit in her stomach. She had always been a person who tried to avoid conflict, a woman who preferred to keep her head down and focus on the quiet life she had built for herself as a librarian in the small town of Westbridge. But today she found herself in a place she never expected to be, standing before a judge for a simple traffic violation. Nia had always been careful behind the wheel. She had never been someone to rush or break the rules, but that morning had been different. There had been an emergency at the library. A fire alarm had gone off in the middle of her shift, and she had to leave early to ensure everything was secure. It was a small issue, nothing serious, but it caused her to be late for work, and the stress had caused her to lose track of time. When she was finally on the road, she was so focused on getting to her destination that she didn't realize she had crossed a red light. Now here she was sitting in this cold, sterile room, trying to keep her cool, as she listened to the judge's voice calling her name. Judge Thomas Caldwell was known around town for his no-nonsense attitude and strict rulings. Some people admired him for his stern approach, while others found him arrogant and dismissive. Either way, Nia had heard enough stories about him to know that he didn't tend to show mercy to anyone, especially not to people like her, black women from working-class backgrounds who were often treated as if they were invisible or inconsequential. When Nia stood up to approach the bench, her hands trembled ever so slightly. She tried to steady her voice as she explained her situation calmly and respectfully. She spoke of the alarm at the library and how it had caused the delay, but the judge didn't seem to listen. His eyes were fixed on the paperwork in front of him, as if she weren't even there. His expression was unreadable, but the dismissive tone in his voice was unmistakable. "Miss Williams," he said sharply, "you were still in violation of the law. You broke the traffic signal, and that's not something I can overlook. I'm imposing a fine of $200. Nia felt her face flush as she tried to hide the disappointment building inside of her. She had hoped for some understanding, for a moment of compassion, but instead she was met with cold indifference. She had expected to pay a fine, sure, but the way he dismissed her explanation, as if it didn't matter at all, stung more than she had anticipated. She nodded slowly, accepting the ruling without further protest, but inside she felt a wave of frustration wash over her. How could someone so easily disregard the human element of the situation? How could they not see her as a person first and foremost? In that moment, she was just a name on a piece of paper, a mere statistic to Judge Caldwell. As she walked back to her seat, the weight of the fine seemed to grow heavier with each step. The tension in the courtroom hung in the air like a cloud that wouldn't dissipate. Nia felt small, insignificant in a place that was meant to administer justice, but in reality had often fallen short of it. Walking out of the courtroom, Nia couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to her like a second skin. Her shoulders hunched as she moved quickly through the hallway, not wanting to linger in a place that had just reminded her of how invisible she felt in the world. For a moment, the outside world seemed distant, like she was walking through a fog. She could hear the murmurs of the people in the hallway, but the noise felt muffled and far away, as if she were underwater. Once she stepped into the sunlight, the sharp contrast of the bright afternoon hit her like a wave, and she squinted against the light, trying to ground herself back into reality. She reached for her phone, pulling it out of her purse and staring at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. She could message her sister or her best friend, but what would she say? How could she explain the sting of that courtroom moment that had left her feeling so small, so powerless? The fine was one thing. $200 wasn't a small amount of money, but that wasn't what bothered her. It was the way the judge had looked at her dismissively, as if she were just another nameless face in a sea of violations, as if her story didn't matter. It was the kind of treatment she had grown all too familiar with over the years, the subtle dismissals, the quiet judgments, the way people saw her only for what was on the surface, a black woman in a small town trying to make her way in a world that often didn't seem to want her in it. She knew it wasn't just about the fine, it was the systemic way in which people like her were treated, as less than or as invisible. It was the injustice that wasn't always loud or obvious, but was woven into the fabric of everyday life like a quiet hum that never went away. She had learned to navigate it, to hold her head up high, even when the world seemed intent on reminding her of her place. but today she couldn't shake the feeling of being defeated. Nia took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. It was an all too familiar feeling, one she had learned to push down and ignore, but today it seemed to rise to the surface more violently than usual. She had hoped for a moment of grace, a moment where she might be seen as more than just her circumstances, more than the color of her skin. But that moment never came. Instead, she was handed a fine and a lesson she already knew too well. As she walked to her car, she made the decision that she wouldn't let this moment go quietly. She would not let it simmer beneath the surface. She had a voice, and she would use it somehow. She didn't know exactly how, but she knew she would turn this feeling into something that would make the world take notice, something that would demand to be heard. It wasn't just about the fine, it was about everything that had led up to it and everything that would follow. Nia sat in her car for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. Her mind was spinning, but beneath it all there was something else, a fire starting to burn deep within her, the kind of fire that would not be easily extinguished. She didn't know it yet, but this was the spark of something greater, something that would change everything for her and for the people who had been quietly enduring the same injustices. That evening, after the world had settled into its familiar rhythms of quiet and routine, Nia sat at her desk in the small apartment she called home. The window was cracked open just enough to let in the cool evening air, and the soft hum of the street outside felt strangely comforting. She opened her laptop and stared at the blank screen for a few moments, her mind still swirling from the events of the day. The fine, the judge's dismissive gaze, the sense of injustice. It all felt too heavy to ignore. But she wasn't about to let the weight of it crush her. Instead, she turned to what always helped her make sense of the world, her writing. For years, Nia had kept a secret. To most people, she was just the reserved librarian who wore glasses and always had a gentle smile, the kind of woman who quietly helped people find the books they needed, but never sought the spotlight. But Nia had another identity. She was a poet, a best-selling poet whose work had touched the hearts of readers across the country, though very few knew her true identity. Writing was her escape, her refuge from the harsh realities of life. Her poems were raw and unflinching, filled with the beauty and pain of living as a Black woman in a world that often overlooked her. She had written under a pseudonym, carefully crafting each verse and paragraph with an intimacy that few would ever understand. Her collections, often exploring themes of identity, race, love, and struggle, had earned her accolades from the literary world. Yet her name remained a secret. Her works were admired, but few knew the woman behind them. Nia had always kept her poetic persona separate from her everyday life, afraid of what would happen if the two worlds collided. But today, something inside her had shifted. She could no longer keep her voice hidden. The unfairness she had experienced in the courtroom, the way Judge Caldwell had dismissed her so easily, it was too much to ignore. She couldn't let it slide into the background like she had done so many times before. Nia opened the document where she had begun drafting her latest poem. She had started it on her phone earlier, typing a few lines when the anger first surged inside her. Now sitting at her desk, she returned to it, the words flowing like a river breaking through a dam. She wrote about the sting of being overlooked, the humiliation of being treated like a statistic rather than a person. She wrote about the hope that kept her going, the quiet strength that had helped her survive so many other moments of injustice. The poem quickly took shape. It was sharp, cutting through the layers of frustration and pain that had built up over the years, and yet it held a quiet kind of resilience. In it, she described a woman standing in a courtroom, a woman who had been judged not for her actions, but for who she was, a woman whose voice had been silenced by the weight of the world. Nia wrote with fury and tenderness, creating verses that told the story of not just one woman's struggle, but the collective struggles of many who had been treated unfairly simply because of their race, their gender, their place in society. As the hours slipped by, Nia didn't stop writing. Each word seemed to release another layer of the burden she had been carrying, a burden that had been building long before the fine was ever handed down. Her fingers danced across the keys, channeling everything she had felt that day, all the pain, all the frustration, and yes, all the hope too. When she finally stopped, the poem was done. Nia sat back and read it over, her heart racing in her chest. It wasn't just a poem, it was a declaration. It was her voice, her story, her truth laid bare for the world to see. She knew she wasn't the only one who had felt this way. She knew her words would resonate with others. This was more than just a piece of art. It was the start of something bigger, something that would make people listen. For the first time in a long time, Nia felt like she was finally taking control. She wasn't going to be silent anymore. The following morning, Nia awoke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the curtains, but her mind felt restless. She couldn't stop thinking about the poem she had written, how the words seemed to have taken on a life of their own. There was a fire within her now, a resolve that had been sparked by the events of the day before. It wasn't just a moment of anger anymore. It was a movement, one she had unknowingly set into motion. As she prepared her coffee, her thoughts drifted back to the decision she had made the night before. She would share her poem. Not in secret, not under a pseudonym. The world needed to hear it, to hear her in her own voice. Nia wasn't naive. She knew that by revealing her true identity as a poet, she was stepping into uncharted territory. She had always kept her two worlds separate, guarding her privacy fiercely. The literary world she had built under a different name was hers alone, and she never dreamed of intertwining it with her everyday life. But the more she thought about the injustice she had faced, the more she realized she couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't keep hiding behind a veil of anonymity while the world continued to look the other way. She sat at her desk again, rereading the poem. It was everything she had felt: the courtroom, the fine, the sting of being treated as less than, captured in carefully crafted lines. It felt raw and honest, and she knew it was the right time. Nia pulled up her social media accounts and hesitated for a moment. The idea of sharing something so personal with the world felt like standing naked in front of an audience, vulnerable and exposed. But her fingers didn't falter. She typed a brief message. Asterisk, this is my truth, and I am ready to share it with all of you. Let it speak for those who feel unheard. Asterisk. She posted the poem. The response was immediate. Within hours, the words she had poured into the screen the night before began to spread. People began to comment, share, and discuss the verses. The message resonated with so many. Her poem became more than just a statement. It became a rallying cry. For the first time, Nia wasn't just writing for herself. She was writing for every person who had ever felt ignored, dismissed, or judged based on something beyond their control. Nia watched as her words traveled from one social media platform to another. It felt like her poem was everywhere, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. People were quoting it, analyzing it, praising it. Readers from all over the country shared their own experiences, recounting their struggles with the same systems that had failed them. Her words sparked conversations about race, justice, and the need for real change. The world had finally noticed. But it wasn't just readers and followers who took notice. The poem caught the attention of journalists and activists. Interviews were scheduled, news outlets reached out for quotes, and before she knew it, Nia was becoming a figure in a conversation that she had only ever been a part of as a quiet observer. The poem had ignited something, and it was gaining momentum. One afternoon, Nia received a call from an editor at a well-known publishing house. They had seen the poem online and wanted to talk about the possibility of publishing her work, both her poetry and a collection of essays that could expand on the themes she had explored in her recent post. The idea of being seen in such a way was overwhelming, but it was also incredibly validating. For so long, Nia had written for herself, hidden behind her pen name, but now her voice, her real voice, was being heard. She felt a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. The world was finally listening, and she realized that this was only the beginning. Her poem had sparked something, but it was clear that her journey was far from over. What had started as a single, quiet moment of frustration had become a wave of change, and Nia was ready to ride it. The fire inside her was now an unrelenting blaze, one that would carry her forward, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Nia's poem continued to spread like wildfire. What had started as a personal act of expression had transformed into a nationwide conversation. As the days passed, her inbox filled with messages from readers, strangers who had felt something shift within them after reading her words. They shared stories of their own struggles, of moments when they had felt the weight of judgment or the sting of injustice. It was overwhelming, humbling, and, for the first time in a long while, Nia felt like she wasn't alone in the world. News outlets soon began picking up the story. Her poem was featured in major articles, with some even calling her a new voice in social justice poetry. Nia's phone rang constantly. Interview requests, podcast invitations, and speaking engagements were coming in from every direction. The poem had not only resonated with readers, it had sparked something bigger. People were listening, and it was no longer just a story about a traffic fine or a dismissive judge. It was a moment of reckoning for a system that had long ignored the voices of marginalized communities. At first, Nia hesitated to embrace the spotlight. She was still grappling with the shift from being a private poet to a public figure. But the messages, the stories, the support, it was undeniable. She couldn't turn her back on it. She had always written to give voice to those who felt silenced, and now it seemed that her own voice was becoming a vessel for that very cause. Her anonymity had protected her for years, but now it was clear that her true identity, the woman behind the words, was just as important as the work itself. Then, one evening, while Nia was preparing for yet another interview, she received a message that made her pause. It was from a journalist who had been covering the story of her poem. The subject line read, Judge Caldwell's past. New allegations emerge. Curious, Nia opened the message. The journalist had uncovered a history of controversial rulings by Judge Thomas Caldwell, the very man who had fined her the day before. In the years prior, there had been whispers about his biased treatment of people of color in the courtroom, and Nia's case seemed to be the latest example in a long list of questionable decisions. The journalist had connected with sources, and it was clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Caldwell's actions were part of a larger pattern of discrimination. Her heart raced as she read through the information. Nia had always known that the world she was navigating was laced with injustice, but seeing it laid out in front of her, especially in connection to her own experience, was jarring. The more she read, the more it became clear that Judge Caldwell wasn't just another stern figure in a courtroom. He was a part of the very system she had been writing about. Nia sat back, absorbing what this meant. She had never expected this ripple effect, never imagined that her small act of writing would reveal such a tangled web of systemic failures. The poem had struck a chord not only because it expressed her pain, but because it echoed the truth of countless others who had been subjected to the same kind of treatment. This was bigger than just her. It was about exposing the cracks in the system and holding those in power accountable. In the days that followed, the story grew. Media outlets began running feature pieces on Judge Caldwell's past, investigating his record and speaking with people who had encountered bias in his courtroom. Nia's poem became more than just a call to action. It was the spark that ignited a much-needed conversation about fairness, power, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Nia knew this was just the beginning. Her life, once quiet and private, was now part of a larger movement. She could feel the weight of it all, but she also felt empowered. She had started this journey with a simple desire to be heard, and now her voice was changing the narrative. The public's reaction to her words was loud and undeniable, and she couldn't ignore the momentum building around her. For the first time, Nia felt that the world might actually be ready to listen, not just to her, but to everyone who had been silenced for too long. As the weeks passed, Nia's life began to shift in ways she had never anticipated. What had started as an act of personal expression, a poem written in the quiet of her apartment, had evolved into a national movement. News outlets, podcasts, and social media influencers were all buzzing about her story. The poem, and the larger conversation it sparked, had put her at the center of an unfolding dialogue on racial justice, accountability, and the power of the written word. Nia was still processing it all, but one thing was clear: she could no longer stand on the sidelines. The public's support was overwhelming. Social media flooded with messages from people who felt seen for the first time. Comments from individuals who shared their own experiences of being judged, overlooked, or unfairly penalized flooded her inbox. Some spoke about their encounters with the legal system, others with teachers or employers who had disregarded them based on their race or background. Every message was a reminder that her words had touched something deep within people. They had sparked a fire in others, just as they had in her. But even as the momentum grew, so did the pressure. Nia's inbox also contained criticisms, some subtle, some harsh, questioning her motives, questioning her actions. There were those who accused her of being divisive, of using her poem to attack the system without offering solutions. Others questioned her authority to speak on these issues. To them, Nia was just a poet, a woman who, despite her fame, had no formal background in activism or law. They wondered if her sudden rise to prominence was simply about seeking attention. She was no stranger to criticism, but this time it felt different. She had always been a private person, a woman who had built her success without asking for validation. But now that she had thrust herself into the public eye, the scrutiny was relentless. Each article, each tweet, each opinion piece felt like a judgment. It was hard to ignore, especially when it came from people who didn't fully understand her message or the weight of her words. Yet, amidst the noise, Nia refused to let the doubts drown her. The same fire that had driven her to write the poem still burned inside her. She knew why she had done this. She wasn't speaking for fame or attention. She was speaking for the people who had no voice, for those who felt invisible and forgotten. One day, while sitting at her desk working on a new poem, Nia received a call that would change the course of her journey. It was from the journalist who had exposed Judge Caldwell's past. After weeks of investigation, they had uncovered a disturbing trend. Several of Caldwell's rulings had been questioned for racial bias, with multiple complaints filed against him over the years. The journalist informed Nia that the State Bar Association had officially opened an investigation into the judge's conduct. The revelation was significant. The conversation her poem had started was now leading to real, tangible change. A part of her still couldn't quite believe it. Her words, her truth, were shaking the very foundations of a system that had seemed so impenetrable. Nia sat back, processing the weight of the news. This was more than she had ever hoped for. The poem had sparked outrage, yes, but it had also begun to lead to accountability. It was a powerful reminder that even small actions, ones that might seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, could make a difference. And here she was, a poet from a small town, wielding words that had captured the attention of the nation and set off a ripple of change. She wasn't done yet. Nia knew that the battle for justice wasn't over, that there were still countless voices to lift, still countless injustices to fight. But now she felt more equipped than ever to carry on. The movement she had sparked was bigger than her. It was about the people who had shared their stories, who had found their voices through her words. Nia had found hers, and she wasn't going to stop speaking now. The days after the investigation into Judge Caldwell had begun were a whirlwind for Nia. The news that his past actions were under scrutiny seemed to validate everything she had written, every feeling she had poured into her poem. The support continued to pour in from all corners, but so did the weight of the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. Nia wasn't just the poet anymore, she was a figurehead of something much larger, a symbol for those who had been ignored or oppressed for far too long. As the national spotlight intensified, the expectations grew. But amidst the accolades and demands, Nia stayed grounded in the same principle that had started it all: the truth. Though she had initially hesitated to step into the public eye, she had come to realize that her voice, her real, unfiltered voice, was her greatest strength. It wasn't about seeking fame or validation. It was about using her platform to continue speaking the truth, to push the conversation further, to demand accountability in ways that mattered. And as the story of Judge Caldwell's investigation gained more traction, it was clear that the conversation wasn't just about a single courtroom incident or one unjust fine. It was about the broader issue of systemic racism and how those in power often escaped real scrutiny. Nia found herself invited to a growing number of panels, forums, and discussions. Her days were filled with interviews, some enlightening and others challenging. Each time she was asked to speak, she reflected deeply on the words she would say. It was important to her that she not be reduced to a symbol or a soundbite. She had lived through real, lived experiences, experiences that went beyond the confines of her poem. The issues were complex, layered, and far-reaching, and Nia wanted to ensure that her message wasn't just being packaged for consumption. She wanted it to resonate deeply with the people who needed to hear it most. One evening, Nia found herself on stage at a major conference on racial justice. The audience was filled with activists, scholars, and everyday people who had been moved by her poem. The air buzzed with energy, anticipation hanging thick in the room. She had spoken at smaller events before, but this was different. This was bigger, and she knew her words could make a difference here. As she took the microphone, the weight of the moment pressed against her, but she stood tall. She began with a simple statement. I wrote that poem not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel invisible, for everyone who has ever been dismissed or forgotten. It is my truth, but it's also the truth of countless others who don't have the platform or the words to speak out. The crowd fell silent as Nia continued, speaking from the heart. She told stories, both hers and others, of small moments of bias and larger systems of injustice. She spoke of those who had been penalized, excluded, or simply erased from the narrative. And then she brought it back to the poem, to the fine, to Judge Caldwell, to the work that was still yet to be done. The poem, she said, was my way of holding a mirror up to the world. It was a way of saying, asterisk, this is the reality. This is what we face every day, asterisk, and it's not enough to just acknowledge it. We have to demand change. As the crowd erupted in applause, Nia felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that the road to real change was long and often discouraging. But for the first time, she felt an undeniable sense of hope. Her words had already ignited something powerful, something that was out of her control but deeply connected to her. In the weeks that followed, Nia began writing again, but not just poems. She started working on a book, a collection of essays that would expand on the themes she had explored through her poetry, taking a deeper dive into the issues of race, justice, and the power of narrative. She wanted to bring people into her world, to show them how systemic issues weren't just about big moments. They were embedded in the everyday. It was the way you were treated in a courtroom, the way your voice was ignored in the halls of power. Nia wasn't sure where this path would lead her, but one thing was certain. She was committed to seeing it through. The poem had been a spark, but now she was stoking the fire. And this time, there was no turning back. As Nia's influence grew, so did her understanding of the profound responsibility she now carried. She had begun this journey seeking only to share her truth, but she found herself standing at the intersection of art, activism, and change. Her name was now widely recognized, not just as a best-selling poet, but as a leader, a voice for those whose stories have long been ignored. With every panel, every discussion, every interview, the weight of her words became heavier, but so did her sense of purpose. She had awakened something, and she was determined to keep it alive. The investigation into Judge Caldwell had continued to unfold in the media, and soon the public's focus was expanding from just the judge's actions to the broader issues of racial bias in the legal system. His past decisions were now under intense scrutiny, and a growing movement was calling for accountability, for reforms that would prevent future injustices. Nia's poem had not only brought his actions to light, but had sparked a wave of dialogue across the nation. But even as the systems began to show signs of cracking, Nia knew that her work was far from finished. It had been months since she had first shared her poem, but every day felt like a new chapter in this unfolding story. Her life, once private and quiet, was now filled with moments of deep reflection and intense action. She was invited to meet with legislators, to sit with experts, and to collaborate with other activists who had long been fighting for justice. The more she learned, the more she realized how much work there was to do, how many lives were still affected by the very systems she had begun to challenge. And yet, despite the progress, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the world was still, Nia would sit in her room, surrounded by the stacks of letters and messages that had flooded in since her poem went viral. Some were uplifting, stories of healing, of empowerment, but others were painful. People shared their own experiences of suffering, their stories of being trapped in systems that refused to change, their frustrations at the slow pace of progress. It was a reminder that real change was never easy, and that the fight she had entered into was far from over. One evening, as she prepared for another round of interviews, Nia took a deep breath and turned her attention back to her writing desk. She had promised herself that despite everything, she would never stop creating. The poem that had started it all had been the opening act, but it wasn't the final word. There was so much more she wanted to say, so much more she needed to express. Her pen was her weapon, and she was determined to use it until her last breath. Her new project, the collection of essays she had begun working on, was taking shape. It was raw, personal, and brutally honest. She wanted to open people's eyes not just to her story, but to the stories of others, stories that had been buried under the weight of silence. Her book would speak to the injustices that existed in the world, but it would also hold space for hope. Nia had seen the power of her poem in action, how one small act of vulnerability had snowballed into something much bigger. She believed in the power of words to change the world, to shift hearts and minds, and now she was using her words to keep that change alive. As the years passed, Nia's name became synonymous with resistance, with hope, and with the relentless pursuit of justice. But she had never forgotten the core of her mission: to speak the truth, to write from the heart, and to never allow the world to forget those who had been left behind. Her work had transformed from something personal to something universal. And through it all, Nia remained a poet at her core, using her voice not only to speak for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. She had started as just a woman with a poem, but now she was a force that no one could ignore. The fight for justice would continue, but Nia knew that as long as she had a voice, she would keep pushing, keep writing, and keep fighting for a world where everyone's story could be heard.